Come for the bread, stay for the politics. This is Let Them Eat Bread, and I'm Ben Walsh. Today, we're going to be making my traditional challah recipe, and I'm going to be explaining usually what happens is I would be talking to you during the rise about some politics, but first, for this week, since our first ever episode, I am going to be explaining kind of what this show is about, how it's going to work, and how we're going to work together in the future. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create our yeast mixture. So I'm going to take my measuring cup here and my scale. Let's tear the scale here. Alright, we're going to ounce this. You want to be using drinkable water for this as much as possible, so water that you would want to drink. And I'm going to put about 6 ounces of water in here. A little more, a little less isn't going to hurt anybody. Next, we're going to microwave this for about 30 seconds. It might be a little more or a little less. The reason we're doing this is that the water that the yeast is going to be placed in needs to be warm enough so that the yeast can do their thing. And while we're doing that, let's get our yeast out. We're using active dry this week. Make sure to always keep your yeast in the fridge. The yeast is happiest there, at least until you're ready to use it, and you'll be happier if your yeast is happier. So we just have another second left on our water. Alright. Let's see how warm this is. Now, lukewarm water is between 105 and 110 degrees, so that's what I'm looking for. Alright, so this is perfect. So here's what we're going to do. This is the right temperature, so we are going to bring over a bowl for our yeast. Place our water in here. Now, since this is a cold bowl, it will cool a little bit. It shouldn't harm it that much, so don't worry about it. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a tablespoon of sugar and lightly, this is just your plain white granulated sugar, so let's just sprinkle that on top here. Alright, mix that in. I'll be using a fork to mix this in. You want to mix the sugar into the mixture here until it's dissolved. Alright, perfect. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our active dry yeast. We want a scant tablespoon. So a scant tablespoon means just less than a tablespoon. So let me see if I can... So you can see here it's not the full tablespoon. It's going to be a little less than that, and we're going to sprinkle it on top, just like we did the sugar. Okay, and once you've done that, take your fork again, and you're just going to lightly fluff it. So this is taking the tines of the fork, that's the pointy bits, and just kind of swirl in the yeast and the sugar together. Just kind of get them all mixed in there. Alright, so now we need to cover this. We're going to set a timer for 20 minutes. Put this to the side. What this is going to allow our yeast to do... So our yeast is now going to eat the sugar, and it's going to start to bubble up. And this is how we know our yeast is alive, and this is what's called blooming the yeast. So for an active dry recipe like this, an active dry yeast recipe like this is what we're going to be doing. Remember, put your yeast back in the fridge. Alright, so now what we're going to do in the meantime, we're going to put our water measuring container back on our scale. And by the way, if you don't have a scale, just take a cup, a little less than that. So if you have a cup measure, you want to fill it about 3/4 of the way. So about 3/4 cups is 6 ounces. So what we're going to do is we're going to pour some more water in here. Again, about 6 ounces. Not a little much, but that's right. So at this point, I'm going to microwave this water again for about another 30 seconds. This is so that when I mix in the eggs don't go in cold. The eggs are not supposed to go in cold for this recipe. If your water is not cold and your eggs are not cold, as in you've had your eggs out for a while, you don't need to do this step. But I typically take my eggs out of the fridge just an hour or so before I start the show. So I'm actually going to warm this water to make sure that the ingredients go in at least warm or lukewarm. Just wait for that. Let's put this in the sink here. All right, so as soon as that's ready to come out, we're going to use 3 of our 4 eggs, but we're not going to use 3 whole eggs. We're going to use 2 whole eggs and 1 yolk. Don't throw away the white. It's delicious, and also you can use it for our egg wash later if you don't want to use a 4th egg, or you can just save it in the fridge for another recipe. Alright, so let's see what temperature we have here. We want this to be about 98 degrees. We really don't want it to be over 100 degrees. But if it is, that's okay. It's not going to cook the eggs. It takes a lot more to cook eggs. So this is 104, so it's a little warm. That's alright. So let's take our first egg here. And just put that whole egg in there. Alright. Remember, when you're handling eggs, most of the salmonella is on the outside of the egg, so just be careful. And always wash your hands. And if you get egg on a surface that you shouldn't, like I just did, make sure to clean it up. I'm going to use a paper towel here, just clean up here. And although I should have done it first, and instead of doing it last, we are actually going to split one of these eggs. We are going to split one of these eggs, so. Okay. Careful not to get any white in here, if you can help, any yolk in your mixing container, if you can. Just very carefully get this yolk out. Alright, so I'm going to plop this yolk in here. And as you can see, even though my water is a little hot, the eggs aren't cooking. So I've just touched some eggs, and I'll wash my hands real quick. And we're all about hygiene here, so we want to make sure that we are washing our hands as often as possible. Obviously, before this, I wash my hands, but every time you touch eggs or, things like that, you want to wash your hands as well. So we're going to take our egg white, we're going to put it in the fridge. I'm not going to use it for a wash, but you can later. I'll talk about that when we get there. Alright, so now, we're going to gently whisk this together before we mix in our other ingredients. Alright, perfect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put in our oil and our honey. So our honey is going to serve as our sweetener for this week's recipe. Oh, I spilled a little bit again. Cleaning up here. Alright, so what we're going to do, we need 7 tablespoons of each. I'm going to alternate between the two. It makes it easier. And I'm going to count them with you because I'm terrible at remembering where I've been on counting something. So we're going to do this together so we don't mess it up. Alright, this is 1 for the oil. Let's crack open our honey here. 1 for the honey. Oops, 2. 3. 3. 4. 4. All right, halfway there. 5. 5. 6. 6. All right, last one of each. 7. 7. All right. So we will not be needing this tablespoon measure anymore. So if you wanted, you could have done this 7 of one, then 7 of the other. We're also not going to need our oil for a while, and we're not going to need our honey again. So if you want to start putting things away, you're certainly welcome to do that. I will not be putting things away as I go to keep the show moving, but it will make your life easier if you put stuff away as you go. So I highly recommend it. Okay, so now we have our egg mixture here, and we have our yeast mixture rising over there. How much time do we have on that? 12 minutes left. So you actually don't need to do the whole 20. I'm actually going to check it at 15. Typically I do 15, but I found sometimes that 20 minutes is good as well. And quite frankly, you can't really over bloom the yeast. So if you get to a point where you need the extra 5 minutes to do some of your prep work, don't sweat it. Okay. Let's take this, put this over here. All right. So now we're going to prepare our dry ingredients. So our dry ingredients for this recipe are just flour and salt. I'm using bread flour. I highly recommend that you do as well. Bread flour has a higher gluten content than regular flour, than regular all-purpose flour. And since we're making bread, and bread requires a lot of gluten, we want to use that. So we're going to be doing 6 cups of flour. And for today's recipe, we're just going to be putting it right on our board. All right, I'm going to show you how we're going to mix it today. Usually I will use a standing mixer. You can do this on a board. You can do this in a bowl. It's going to be the same basic thing. The only difference in how you put this together is going to be if you use a standing mixer, and I will show you how to do that next week. All right, so that's our 3rd cup there. It is a small miracle that I've actually been counting when I'm talking here. All right, so it looks like we've about finished this bag. Let's just... All right, so that's 3 and change. We'll just put a little bit less than that extra 2. Let's throw this out real quick. Open a new bag of flour. Hopefully I don't botch opening this bag of flour like I did when I ran my test episode and I had to open a bag of flour. It was embarrassing. I mean, none of you saw it, but it was still embarrassing. They make bags of flour unreasonably difficult to open. Bags of sugar too. For some reason. All right, so we were on 3 and change. Let's do the last 3. All right, so this is going to be 4. There's a reason I'm putting it all in one place, making a mound, by the way. All right, this is going to be 5. Careful not to get the flour off your board, but we want it all in one place. and this is going to be 6. Let's just, there we go. Okay, so that's great. We are done with the flour for now. Keep it out. We're going to need more for dusting. All right, and then the next thing to add here is a nice tablespoon of salt. I use kosher salt, table salt's fine. Okay, so now we are going to mix this together with our hands, just to get the salt and the flour to play together. So I'm just going to take my hand in here and just mix this around. Again, being careful not to get it off the board. And all you're really trying to do here is get the salt to mix in with the rest of the flour, so it's evenly spread out in the flour. Okay, that's probably enough. All right, so the next step here with our flour mountain is we're going to make a well in the middle. So you want to have thick flour walls, because what we're going to do today is we're going to take our liquids and we're going to put them in the middle of this well and slowly mix them in. This is the style of recipe you make if you're trying to show off or if you don't have any bowls or tools. This is a dangerous way of doing this, as the liquid can seep out. So you want nice and thick walls, and you would be very careful with how you are mixing in and how you're taking flour from your walls. But we're going to do it together, and it's going to be great. Make sure that you have nice, thick walls. They don't have to be too tall, just have to be thick. So you can spread out your walls a little bit. I'm using a bench scraper to do that, so use your hands. All right, so we have our well in the middle here. I don't know if you can see it, but essentially there's an area in here about the size of my hand where our liquids are going to go when they're ready. So we have about 7 minutes left on our yeast, which is fine. Just a quick explainer since I have the time. So essentially, if you're doing this in a bowl, first of all, I recommend a large bowl, something around this size if you can, nice and big. But what you want to do is essentially the same thing, but you can use a whisk, right? And you want to create a deep hole. You don't need a hole to the bottom of the bowl, like I have a hole to the bottom of the breadboard here, but it's the same basic concept. You're going to be in there with your hands, mixing all the liquids around. Okay, so let me wash my hands one last time before we start mixing things. All right. So we've got about 6 minutes left. Let's check on our yeast mixture. So it's a little bubbly. It can go for a little longer. Actually, it's all right. So if you look, you can see there's kind of 2 layers. So let me get the light in here so you can see. There are 2 layers. There's kind of a liquid layer and a bubbly layer. And that bubbly layer, you just want a good, healthy, bubbly layer. So this is actually going to be good enough. So I'm going to turn off. I actually just got to 5 minutes. How about that? So I'm going to turn off our timer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pour this into our well. Okay? Be super careful about doing this. Okay. It's in there. We don't have any breaches in our wall. It's good. If you're in a bowl, you don't have to worry about breaches in your wall. It's not going anywhere. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to give our egg mixture a quick spin. And then we're going to pour it in here as well. And again, be careful if you see any leaks, breaks, anything like that. Or if you see it coming up the sides in a dangerous way, immediately stop what you're doing. So now we have it in here. We have our little well. So you're going to take 2 fingers and put them down into the mixture. You're just going to start moving it around in a rounded motion. All right. This is going to allow the liquids in there to start mixing with each other and to start mixing a little bit with those walls. Okay. You want to not push the walls as much as possible. You want to integrate little tiny bits of flour. You want to scrape little tiny bits of flour in. So some of it will come in naturally because it'll just kind of erode, but you can also encourage it a little bit. Remember, this is why we have thick walls, right? You want to pull from the parts that have the thickest walls to thicken this liquid before it has the possibility to break any of your walls. I've just switched to 3 fingers here. And we're just going to pull a little bit from our side. There is one advantage to doing it this way, especially if you have a stone cutting board like I have here, a stone breadboard like I have here. It'll actually warm the breadboard, which is good because otherwise it's very cold, and when you're kneading, it will cool your bread. All right, so you're going to keep doing this. I've switched to all my fingers here. And it'll clump up at first. It's all right. Just use your hands, break up the clumps. The whole point is to get the flour to mix in with the liquid ingredients and to make it more solid than liquid. Again, don't mix hard enough that the liquid mixture starts to escape. If it escapes, it becomes a giant mess. And then effectively you have to start over because you've lost all your ingredients. Which is why I say don't do it this way. We're doing it this way because I thought it'd be fun to do for the first episode, but also because it is the way that you can do this if you don't have any supplies, like bowls. But really, it is one of the more difficult ways to do it. So invest in a bowl. All right. So it's going to start looking a little like, yeah, it's going to start looking a little bit thicker. That's good. Just keep working at it. And again, watch your walls. Take from where it's thickest. And really, the way to take flour from the walls, just run your finger along the inside of those walls. So once this becomes a lot more solid, you can start using your bench scraper or your other hand to kind of throw some of the flour from the sides into it, like I just did here. So you take a little bit, bring it in, take a little bit, bring it in. But again, careful with this method, because if you bring too much in, you can cause a breach in your wall, and then you're SOL. All right, so I've just brought in some of our flour from the excess wall. I can feel it starting to thicken up now. So you should start to feel yours thickening up too. At this point, it's going to feel like slop is a terrible word, but kind of that drudgy, muddy feel. Non-Newtonian fluid, maybe? Actually, not really. But keep swirling it. Keep getting rid of lumps and bring in more flour where you can. This will become a dough, I promise. It really doesn't look like one now, but I promise it will become one. And you should actually begin to feel that it's coming together a little bit. It'll feel thicker. It is getting thicker. All right, so we're gonna tease in more of our flour with the bench scraper or your other hand. I already have a leak in my wall. That's bad, but at this point, the batter dough is thick enough that it's not all flying through that hole. So it's really not the end of the world now that I have this little tiny leak. But you know, if I had it earlier, game, set, match. We're out of show business here. So just little bits at a time. Take it in and mix. All right, and the more that you stir, You should feel it coming together. Alright, I'm going to start to break down most of my walls here because this is pretty thick now. So once it resembles like a cake batter, you can pretty much break down your walls. And just start mixing all of it in. Again, use your bench scraper or your other hand to kind of control that. Because you still want it to not go everywhere. But at this point you have, so here's what I'm going to do. So now that we have pretty much gotten it to a thickness where it can't really ruin itself if it moves, we're just going to start mixing it in. I'm using the bench scraper to kind of move the flour into the doughy mixture, but I'm still using my other hand to kind of mix it together here. So a shaggy dough should start to form. Yeah, there we go. Alright, so use your tools if you have them, your hands if you don't. Just mix this together, keep it moving. You're trying to get the flour to incorporate in this doughy mixture. And as much as possible, you don't want it to stick to your board here. You can do that by moving the flour around a bunch, which is what I'm doing. And so you can see our shaggy mass here starting to come together a little bit. Use the bench scraper to get this stuff off my fingers. Don't worry about the dough touching your fingers. I mean, you can wear gloves if you want to. I just spend a lot of time washing my hands instead. And by the way, all this gets baked. So at pretty high temperatures, so you don't really have to worry about it too much. Alright, so once it starts to come together in a single mass, and you can play with it a little, you're going to start the kneading process. There are lots of ways to knead. The way I typically do it is I do a push and pull method, but there are lots of ways to do it, and I'll show you how to do it. All right. So now you can see that effectively this is one item, right? I can pick it up, right? That's kind of your best tell. I mean, but this is kind of where you want it to be. And actually, this is still, it's a little cooler than we'd like it to be at this stage in the process. But it's very soft, and soft is good. So you can see that I'm using the back of my hand here to press down into our dough before bringing it back with my fingers and folding it in upon itself. So I recommend this way. It's one of the easier ways to knead bread, in my opinion. But another thing you can do is you can take two hands, pull, and then fold with two hands if you want. So you take your hands like this. You put one hand at the back of the bread that you're not folding. Take one hand and put it at the front of the bed. You pull it out so you stretch it as much as possible. Then you use that same hand to bring it back. And whenever possible, you should be trying to rotate your your dough about 90 degrees each time that you knead it. All right, so this is starting to stick. So when it does that, it needs more flour. And as you knead it, you're going to find, and as you develop the gluten, it's going to want more flour. So we're going to go in to our bag of flour once more and get out, let's start with this much flour. So this is probably closer to like an eighth cup of flour. So using your bench scraper or your hand, move your dough around, try and coat your dough in the new flour. That'll dry it out and help it absorb. Well, it won't dry out the bread, but it will help the dough absorb because you're essentially putting the flour on all the sticky parts. You don't have to speed up with your kneading. In fact, I saw one method for kneading that if you just kind of put your dough into a ball and do like one knead, like one serious knead every 5 minutes, I think, just keep it covered, you can get the dough to come along. We're not going to do that ever on this show. It's just going to be too much of a waste of your guys' time. But you know, if any way that I show you to knead bread, these two methods, or any other method you can find, are uncomfortable to you, or you don't like them, or it's not working for you for whatever reason, there are plenty of resources online about how to properly knead bread. Or, if you have the resources to do this, buy yourself a standing mixer. The standing mixer takes all the guesswork, or a bread machine, really takes all the guesswork out of kneading, because the machine does it. And although you have to check on it and scrape down the sides, it really minimizes the amount of work that you're doing. So you can actually see now that our shaggy mass is more or less a coherent dough ball. Now we are going to keep kneading it and keep stretching this dough out because we need gluten development, and that's what kneading does. This process of stretching out the dough. Let's bring some more flour in here. It's getting a little sticky. So I would recommend you do this for about 10 minutes. I'm not going to time myself today. I will time myself when I'm using the bread, when I'm using the stand mixer next week, just because it'll be easier that way, and it will honestly stop me from talking too much. But so the reason I suggest 10 minutes is it's a good amount of time to get it kneading. Your hand should warm the dough. You should be able to feel the dough's getting a little warmer. And by the way, you want your dough warm at least a little bit because you want the yeast to do their thing, to work in there. And if they're not able to do that, your bread is going to rise either very slowly or not at all. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to that step. All right. So if your bread feels like it's getting stickier as you're kneading it, congratulations, you're doing it right. Keep that up. You can over-knead things. It's kind of hard to do, but you can do it. So just be careful about that. So I'm going to knead it to get the rest of this flour in. And once I do that, I'm actually going to check it for doneness. And I'll show you how to do that. Unfortunately, this episode is not going to be live. I'm pre-recording it and putting it up for you guys. Hopefully next week I can figure out a way to get it live. For some reason, YouTube is not responding well to this. Maybe I'll stream live on Facebook instead. Either way, we'll find a way to get this live. I want us to do this together. I want there to be a back and forth. If you have bread questions, I want to be here doing it with you, experiencing it with you, playing with the dough with you. So that if we struggle together. And at the end of the day, the whole point of this show, is for us to get better at making bread together. So that's what we're going to do. Hopefully. I will find a way. Alright, so if you feel that your dough is not stretching, switch methods, right? I'm going to switch methods here a little bit. Get that nice stretch in on my dough. Move it. Yeah, there we go. By the way, you're not going to hurt your dough by stretching it. I probably should have said that earlier, but it's true. You are only helping your dough by stretching it. You want it to be somewhat elastic. Alright, we are pretty much done with the flour I put down on here. So let me just do a couple more kneads here, and then we'll give it a check, see how we're doing. It's a bit of a workout. I recommend not doing arm day before you bake bread. Or if you are going to do arm day, use a machine instead to make your bread. Alright, so I have my I gave away the game a little bit. I have my dough ball here. I'm going to take one hand in an L shape, like when I make the loser sign. I'm going to put it around a portion of my bread. A little bit's going to come up, and I'm going to take it, I'm going to twist, so I get one massive dough. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use our thumbs to make this into a circle shape. Okay, stretching it out all the while, and when it gets pretty stretchy, you want to hold it up to the light. You want to keep stretching it. Slow and steady, so that the thinner it gets, the slower you want to go. So what you're checking for here is if you can stretch it and see the light coming through it without it breaking, then it's done. And this is done. So you can't see me, but you can see the light coming through to me, right? So this means this is done. This is great. Okay. So before we let it rise, we're going to shape it a little bit. We're going to shape it for rising. So I'm going to put it here. Another way, by the way, you can test if you don't have a light, do the window pane test and put your finger in it. It should spring up very slowly, about 3/4 of the way. It should not come back all the way. Okay. All right. So now we're going to shape it into a ball. We're going to take our hands, we're going to cup them like this. We're going to put our hands underneath the bread, and we're going to use that cup to move the bread around the board. The bread will stick to the board. That's all right. We're actually using the stickiness, the tackiness of the bread to make it into a nice taut ball from which it will rise in a nice taut manner. All right? And you'll start to see it come together a little bit, and you'll see it get more taut. And it'll be a nice, smooth top. So I'm going to put my finger on here. Ta-da! Comes up 3/4 of the way. Perfect. We are ready to rise. So at this point, if you need a vessel to rise this in, and you're going to need some oil. Use canola today. Sometimes use olive, sometimes use canola. It doesn't matter. So I'm using a glass bowl to rise my bread in. Glass typically stays cold, so in order to remedy that and to make sure our bread has a nice environment to rise in, I'm going to run my bowl under some warm water. So right now, take a moment to prepare. Find yourself a bowl. You want like a big mixing bowl to rise this in. Or if you don't have a big mixing bowl to rise this in and you're doing this method without any tools, you want to find a flat surface somewhere where this can rise. So like a big plate. But again, if it's a ceramic plate or a glass plate, run under some warm water first and dry it off, just to make sure that no matter what you're doing, you're giving your bread a nice warm environment to rise in. This is also a good time to wash your hands. Alright, so now that our rising bowl is nice and warm, I'm going to dry that off. Especially dry off the inside, you really don't want any water in it. Another way that you can get your bread to rise more is clean the inside of your bowl, or use a bowl that has recently been cleaned. Helps it rise better. This is the same for meringues, but we're not making meringue, we're making bread. So, alright, so I've got my warm bowl here. Dry my hands a little bit. So now what we're going to do, we're going to put about 2 tablespoons roughly of oil in our bowl. Alright, just so a little tiny layer forms. So now you can use a spatula to do this, a spoon. I'm just going to start by pouring this around, you want a nice even coat of oil on the bowl. You can do this with your hands too, just get your hands in there and get yourself a nice even oil layer. This will stop the bread from sticking to your bowl and will allow it to rise. Clean bowl, oil bowl, lots of things we need to help this bread rise in the world. Alright, so we've got that. I'm going to take our bread sticking, just kind of come under it. I'm using a bench spare, but you can always use your hands. If you want to avoid this problem, just take a little bit of spare flour, just put it underneath your bread ball. Alright, take our bread ball, we're going to plop it in our bowl here, spin it around. Going to flip it over real quick just to get oil all over it. This will help it rise. Alright, so now our bowl is covered, our dough ball is covered in oil, and we're going to get some plastic wrap and a towel and put it on top. Just rinsing the oil off real quick. If you don't have access to plastic wrap, you can just use a towel. Just be aware that if you just use a towel, you're likely to get bread on it, so you'll just have to wash it after you finish eating your bread. I also recommend just having, if you can, having a towel that you use just for bread baking. Just makes things easier. Okay. So you're going to get a bread towel, pour it over like this, put it over bread. This double insulation allows the bread to rise nicely because it keeps all the warmth in. Now, if you want your bread to be warm while it's rising, so there's a couple ways to do that. I'm going to set a timer for an hour because I've just put this to rise. And we'll check this after an hour. But in the meanwhile, well, so before you put yours in, if you don't have a warm space, or you're worried about a warm space, there are a couple things you can do to make sure your space is warm. One, obviously warm your bowl like we just did. Another thing you can do is if you have an oven with a broil setting, like a low broil setting, put it on the low broil setting for a couple of minutes. I would say 2 to 3 max. And once you've done that, turn it off, open the oven a little bit, and put your bread in there once it's cooled off a little bit. That'll create a warm environment. Obviously, just make sure that it's not too hot and you're not killing off the yeast before they have the chance to make the bread rise. Another thing you can do is if you have heat in your home or you're actively using heat in your home, you can put it there. If you live in a warm area, the best place for your bread is upstairs, right? Heat typically rises, but you don't want your bread to be too hot or in direct sunlight. So just make sure that you have some place that's warm, at least 70 degrees in your house that you're rising your bread in. It's going to make it a lot easier for your bread to rise, and you'll have a nice, good rise after an hour. At this point, our bread has risen, so let's take a look at it. There you go. So our bread's risen, it's about doubled in size. So what we're going to do, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of this and just some of our spare flour and just sprinkle it on the board. Keep this open, we're going to use more of this. Let's take our plastic off. We try not to waste here on this show, and I highly recommend that you don't waste either. So what we're going to do is we're going to put our plastic right on the scale because we're going to use our scale for measuring. Let's just take this here. There we go. So I'm going to take that. Okay. Alright. So you're going to want to knead this just for a minute or two, just to kind of recombine everything. So I'm just kind of here. And also, you want to get some of the bubbles out. It's going to be harder to shake the bubbles in it. And don't worry, you're not going to inhibit its second rise. Benny, you're going to talk about politics for another hour while it rises? No, I'm not. So what's going to happen now, once I do this, is we're going to measure and we're going to cut. Now is a good time to take out a knife if you have one, or a pen scraper if you have one. Okay. So we're going to weigh, what's going to happen now is we're going to weigh the bread, cut it, and shape it. And once we do that, I'm going to give you instructions for what to do for the rest of your bread, and then this show will end. And we will resume next week. I will post a picture of the loaf of bread that I have made. I encourage all of you to do the exact same thing, to comment on, to share your pictures of it on Facebook with me. And then I will see you next week for making it, and hopefully by then it will be live. All right, so how much does this weigh? All right, so about 60. Actually, let's make this a little smaller. All right, come together for me. Come together for me. There you go. That's fine. It's not gonna. All right, if you have to knead it to get it back into kind of a ball shape, that's fine to do that. Clearly, mine wasn't sitting the way it normally does, so just kind of get it into a ball here. Let's put it back on our scale. All right, so about 60. So it's 59 and change. All right, so this has absorbed most of the flour, so feel free to put more flour on here if you need it, which is what I'm going to do. Take some more of this flour, sprinkle it around. All right. And then this is really not coming together for me, so I'm going to knead it for a little bit. But you've just weighed yours, so if your bread is doing better than mine, what you can do is you can cut it up. So mine weighed 59 and change. So you're going to want to make sure that your bread is divided into, we're going to do a 3 braid challah this week. I'll experiment with more braids as we do more episodes, but for this one we're just doing the basic, and actually next week we're probably just doing the basic then too. Alright, so this is coming together much more now. Alright, very good. Alright, we're going to bring it more or less into a top ball, but I'm not too worried about it because we are just going to cut it up. Let's use some flour to cover up this oil here. By the way, a good way to kind of cover up the oil so you don't have extra oil on your bread, so just put some extra flour down. Okay. Not too much because you really don't want your bread to be too floured, or else the strands won't stick together. All right, so let's give it a shot. By the way, a lot of this is guess and check as far as the weight of your bread goes. I just did what looks like a third. Let's put it on here. All right, this is way too much. 25. Just gonna chop a little bit off of there. 24. Okay. I'm gonna chop a larger chunk off. All right, 20 and change. Let's see if I can't get it down to like 9/19. Okay, 1989. All right, so this is gonna be 1. All right, let's go back to our original dough here. Cut off another chunk. How much is this weigh? This is 17.67. So I'm gonna put some more of our little pieces of dough. 1901, 1996. All right, perfect. So this little piece here and this little piece here are probably perfect. So now that we have our 3 sized pieces here, we're going to make them into little balls like we've been doing before. Remember to use the cupping motion with your hands. Alright, we're just going to place them on the side of our board here to work with later. I know you can't see them because they're behind the oil, but I promise you they're there. Alright, and again, don't worry about these balls being too taut or perfect. We're literally just about to roll them out into strands. Okay. At this point, we can turn off our scale. Oops. All right. So now we need something that we're going to put our strands on once we've made them. So I'm going to line a baking sheet. I'm going to use a silicone mat and a 17 by 11 inch baking sheet. You can use a standard size baking sheet, which I believe is 10 by 13, and line it with parchment paper or a silicone mat if you have one. This loaf tends to get a little large, which is why I use the larger baking sheet, but you don't have to. Also, this is the same thing that you will cook it on, so it is easier to shape it on there as opposed to try and moving it again once it's risen a second time. If you can, you should avoid rising it. You should avoid moving it after you rise it. Okay, that being said, let's put our tray. Put our tray back here because I don't have a ton of room. Okay, we have our silicone mat here. Let's put it down. Perfect. All right, so we're going to take our first one. Take this out we got right here. And actually we can put this in the sink because we're done with it. Probably. Yeah, no, we're done. Alright, so the way I like to do this, let's move our balls up here, make it easier, is I'm just going to take my hand, my flat hand, I'm going to roll it underneath my hand there. So you can see now we've created a little cylinder. I'm going to take both hands, I'm just going to front and back. And by the way, while I'm doing this, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm moving my hands out. So I'm doing a forward out, backwards out, and then starting over. Forwards out, backwards out. And that is how we're going to get a nice long log. So if your countertop has wheels, like mine does, and you need to hold it still, then assume the holding it still position, which I've done now. Alright, and we're just going to keep rolling these out. I like these to be pretty long. You don't want to make it so long that it's not thick enough to... So I use this for sandwich bread. So I intentionally kind of make these big enough so that when they rise in the oven, well, then they rise a second time out of the oven, and when they rise a third time in the oven, which is to say when they cook, that they don't, so they're big enough that a sandwich will fit on them. A nice sandwich. Feel free to tell me in the comments what you use your bread for. And also, if you have a recipe that you want me to try, a recipe either that you're struggling with or your own recipe, you should definitely, I would love to try your recipe on the show. And I'd love to try recipes that you guys recommend on the show. And hey, maybe my partner and I will have a different type of bread to eat that week. So please feel free to send us a message on Facebook with your recipe if you have one, or if you have one you want us to try, or if you just have any comments about what you use your bread for. Let us know. Alright, so this strand is coming along. I'm going to have to switch kind of diagonal to get it the size I want it. And you can see I'm having a bit of an issue where I'm bulbing on one side. I'll just move this over here. So in order to get that, you're going to put it between your hands and just thin it out. And also, see how it's thicker on this side than it is over here? You're just going to roll it out to that side. Just kind of push some more of that bread dough over there, and you can see it's kind of becoming the right size. Also work on the little boldest part as well. So you want it to be tapered on one side. You're going to use the one-sided tapering in order to attach the strands to each other. So we've got a good strand here. Take a look. You can see it's nice, pretty much even down the line. Little variations, obviously, you can kind of fix those. You may stretch it while you're kneading, while you're shaping. That's all right. So let's take our first strand, put it over here on our baking tray. It'll shrink a little bit on the baking tray, but it's not the end of the world. We can always restretch it. Let's take our second ball of dough. We're do the same thing. And just nice and easy, back and forth. Same motion we were doing before. And start in the thickest part, right? We're trying to make it thinner. You make it thinner by working the thickest part of the bread. Yeah. And sometimes doing the back and forth motion isn't going to work. So again, if you need to, just take your hands and do that first motion we did over and over again. Just move it back up and roll it down. It's another method for rolling it out. There's no good or bad method for doing this. You just want to make sure that when you're doing it, it works best for you. Obviously, you're doing a repeating motion, so be careful with your hands. If you need to stop, shake out your hands. Feel free to do that. Unfortunately, there's no real good substitute for this. You can't really, for rolling it out, you can't really use a machine to roll it out. But if you have a friend or a partner or a roommate or a housemate, maybe ask them to join in, right? You're giving them bread. You're giving them bread anyway. So, well, hopefully you are. If you're gonna ask them, come on, you gotta share your bread. And bread's a staple of people. You want to be a person of the people, right? Okay. So that's silly banter aside. We have our second strand looking good. It's tapered on one end. All right, this is ready. Let's put this over with our first strand. Looking good. Let's take our last one, third and final. Guys, you are going to love it when we do like a 5-strand challah or a 5-braid challah. It's going to be great. It's a mess to put together, but I'll tell you what, it looks really impressive. And if you can master it, and there's so much you can do with a challah. You can do a 2-braid, which is more like a twist. You can do a 4-braid, which looks like a twist but a little bit more complex, which I was doing for a while until I decided that it's a lot of work. But you can do a 7-braid challah, you can do a 9-braid challah. The only thing I'll say about braiding challah is that you should be aware that the more braids you do, the wider your challah is more likely to be and the less long it is going to be, and it probably won't rise as much, right? Because all the strands are nice and tight together and they're working against each other to stop each other from moving. So either your bread will tear in the oven, which will give it that kind of exploding look about it, or it just won't rise, which is fine. There are plenty of sandwiches that enjoy being on a long piece of bread, but there are plenty of ways to eat bread if the bread is long and not tall. But the way I like to make my challah is I like for it to be both long and tall, so it lasts and is also amenable to holding things on it, like slices of meat and cheese. Alright, we are almost done with our third one. I know you guys are probably lightning at this, and you know, in the time I've done it, you've done like 54 of them or some nonsense. Just kidding, that's probably not the case, but hey, this is recorded, so you can always skip forward. Alright, so we've got our third one. Well, actually, let's taper up the one side a little bit. So if you need to taper one side, just take your hand and back and forth over it until it tapers a little bit. You get that little point there. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to bring our tray over. Alright, let's put all the tape a bit together. Alright, so here's our tray. It's kind of hard to see, and there really isn't a good way for me to get the camera angle better, but we're gonna, alright, so we're gonna take our 3 nubs at this end, and the 3 tapered ends, we're gonna attach them all together. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking them and folding them on top of themselves. Okay? Alright, so now do the braid, take 2 strands on one side, we're gonna take the first strand, wrap it over the middle strand, the outside strand, wrap it over the middle strand. Then we're going to bring that up so it's nice and tight. We do the same thing
over and over again. So always take the outside one, bring it over the middle. And as much as possible, bring it up. You want these braids to be as tight as possible. It will make your bread look prettier. Right, so always bring your braids up. Okay. You should try as much as possible to make your strands equal in girth and length, but it's not always the case. So, alright, so we got to the end here. Attach these guys together, tuck them into each other. Alright, we're going to do the same thing on this side, just tuck in this end. So if you don't have attractive ends, just pinch the end and use your hands, tuck it underneath, and you can use your hands a little bit to shape it. Remember, this is going to grow. So if you want to tuck it in a little bit to get a more uniform shape, I'm going to have a bit of a bulge on the one side, unfortunately. So let's try and tuck that under a little bit more. Alright, so your challah should look a little bit like this. Ta-da! There we go. A little bit like this. Alright, so now we're going to take the same plastic that we've been using. Again, not wasting here. You're going to put it the same size down that's been touching the bread. You don't know where the other side's been, so be careful with that. We're going to put it over here. We're going to wrap it in our towel. This is a loose wrapping. Don't wrap it too tightly. We want our bread to grow, have room to grow. And we're going to set a timer for 1 hour. So, at this point, the show is over, but before I go, I'm going to tell you what to do with this bread. So, just like you've seen, we're going to let this bread rise for 1 hour. After we do that, you're going to set your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. While you're doing that, you're going to take your last egg, or your egg white if you want, and you're going to beat it, and using a spoon, a paintbrush, or even your hands if you have to, you're going to cover your bread in a thin layer of egg. This will allow for it to get that beautiful golden brown color that you like. The yolk really helps with that. Your bread may be a little pale if you use egg white, so I really recommend using the full egg. Afterwards, you're not going to use the full egg for that. Afterwards, you can mix it with the egg white and microwave it, knead it. It's delicious. Throw some spices in there. Give it to your dog. Who cares? You can do whatever you can do with it what you want. It's still perfectly edible even after being used to make your bread. Once your bread is painted and your oven is ready at 300 degrees, you're going to set a timer for 35 minutes. Once you do that, you're going to put your bread in the oven and set a second timer for 17 minutes. At 17 minutes, you're going to rotate your bread around just so it cooks evenly on both sides. And you'll know it's done one of two ways. One, and this is how I do it, I'm going to use a thermometer to poke inside the bread. The bread at its thickest point should read 205 degrees at least, between 200 and 205, for being a little bit more flexible about the temperature. And but if you don't have a thermometer, that's okay. The other way to know that it's done is to turn the bread over on its back, so it's you can see the bread's underneath, and give it a wrap on it with your fingers, with your knuckles. If it sounds like it is hollow, it is most likely done. Now, so one more thing about bread, and especially this bread. Your bread will brown in the oven. Your bread may get a little browner than you're comfortable with. It's okay. Let your bread get a little brown. It's not going to hurt it. And you would rather have bread that's baked all the way through that's a little darker than you see on Instagram or what have you, than having bread that's undercooked and can't be eaten. So with that, I leave you. Please leave your please send us pictures of your bread in the comments below on YouTube and Facebook. And we will see you next week, hopefully live, for Let Me Eat Bread's second episode. Take care, everybody.